Juliet is a relatively new faculty member brought in through the cluster hire for the Interdisciplinary Biodiversity Solutions Collaboratory. So she's been here about 3-4 years.
My 4th year.
Oh my goodness, time flies. So she's jointly appointed in the School for Public Policy and Global Affairs and Forest Resource Management in the Faculty of Forestry. Juliet is a political ecologist who works on conflict and governance issues in extraction intensive land use contexts, particularly in China, but also in many other places. And sort of before we hand the microphone back to Juliet, just thinking of where we're at this week and having the Truth and Reconciliation Day on September 30th, recognizing that we are here on the traditional ancestral unceded territory of the Musqueam peoples. Really, it struck me as how relevant, Juliet, your research is for this topic of reconciliation, to really understand what are we as a university body doing here? What are we in our kind of search for knowledge extracting from land and people, not only here in this space, but in other places that we work? And what is our responsibility to use that work for repair? And I think that's the kind of work that Juliet is doing, and it's really inspiring to me personally. So how do we take this work to go from knowledge to action towards reconciling, not just with other people, but with the lands that we live and work and play on? So thank you very much, Juliet, and looking really much forward to your talk.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you for that introduction. It was very kind. I'm going to speak about research that's been sort of ongoing for me for a little while. It is things I started thinking about when I was doing my PhD, but I focused on during my postdoc, but it was during COVID, so it was weird. And I'm now working on with a master's student who I'll introduce a little later in the talk. I'll just kind of give you a case to consider to set the scene, and then talk about deforestation initiatives broadly, kind of concluding with the EUDR, but my abstract written in the optimism of the summer is not accurate to what I'll talk about, if anyone was hoping for that, but I will touch on related things. And the main thing I want to talk about is how I've been comparing existing initiatives in the rubber sector that I think speak to the EU deforestation regulation, which is more coming about now. And I think we can learn things from them by comparing them to each other and also learning some lessons for the EUDR, and then some concluding reflections. Starting with the case. So this is someone I've met many times, actually. I'm going to call him Mr. Kum. That's not his real name. But Mr. Kum is very famous in Nambak district. Is Tetet here? I don't know if she is free today. She's TAing right now. So Tetet, my student, has met Mr. Kum. I've also met him a few times with other people. And he's a smallholder rubber farmer. He has relatives in China. And he learned in the 1990s by visiting some family in China how to grow rubber. So in the 2000s, when prices were going up, he started planting rubber on his own. He became a village chief and encouraging other people in his village to plant rubber. And then a company came along, and this is one of their maps. And the company got a bunch of rubber areas granted to them from the district. The head of the district was very excited to bring rubber in because the price was good and it was a crop that had a lot of benefits from a development perspective, in the opinion of Lao government and also the Chinese that were promoting it. So this company came in and they were brought in as the company for the district. And the district governor said to the company, you can be the main company. We want you to be the company that works with us. We want you to take care of us and we'll take care of you. And they had kind of a vague monopsony process proposed. You'll be the main one that buys because we don't have the capacity to build a rubber factory. So you'll build a rubber factory and we'll give you a bunch of land in certain areas. And it was perfect, the district governor said, because we have a bunch of ethnic minority groups who in the past were living up in the mountains doing shifting cultivation. They didn't know how to make a market-based livelihood. And so we really think rubber is perfect for them. So the district governor said, okay, Mr. Kum, he and his friends are doing rubber already. They're lowland Lao people. They are very capable of doing modern things like rubber tapping. So we'll let them be. But we'll give you a couple plots here of land that belongs currently, it's used by the Khmu people that we moved down from the mountains, but they really need market-based livelihood. So we would love for you to set rubber up for them. They'll farm the rubber when it gets big enough. And then the Camus will have work. The Lao people like Mr. Com have already got their rubber as well. Everyone will be very happy. The factory that the company built was the company, you can see the district capital is around here. I stayed in a little hotel there with my translator. And you can go up this road to get to a couple different villages along there. These are not actually my maps. These are maps from a friend of mine who did her master's project on this, Cecilia Fries. So the company built a big factory, a big investment, a lot of capital to put in. They put it right at the road right here. And this nice road was built by another Chinese company who was building a hydropower dam and some small mining up the road. So it made sense for them to build the road. They put their factory right here. And all these villages were either growing smallholder rubber or doing contract farming or had some concession space given to the company. But about 7 years later, when the trees became mature, things started to shift. The rubber price kind of went down. It wasn't as attractive. So people weren't as excited to plant rubber trees for the company. A lot of other companies came in and the district governor said, oh, we've got plenty of investors. All the districts around them started getting their own rubber companies. The Chinese were basically in a rubber investment boom. And the other thing is Mr. Com had gotten pretty business savvy and he and his sons got their own rubber trucks. And they were running rubber trucks through the area and they had connections in China that were giving better prices. So Mr. Com was very tricky. He was going to lots of different places where people were supposed to be tapping for the company because the company had been promised that they would be the main show in town. Mr. Com was coming through and collecting rubber whenever he would. And he would call his friends in different villages. And fair practice, right? He would say, this is the price I'm getting from my cousin in China. This is the price that I'm seeing in another province over. Like, what do you want? Which one do you think is good? And he would send his son in and collect it. The company, when I spoke to them, pissed. They were not happy. They had a factory they had just built. And if a lot of rubber started getting funneled off, how do they fill the factory? Each day, the way a factory makes money is by operating at capacity each day. And so Mr. Com started getting a little sneaky, sending his son in to collect rubber at night. But rubber comes, it's somewhere in between. In Laos, people usually dry it out in kind of pits in the ground. But a lot of times when rubber is initially tapped, it's very liquidy, right? So it comes up liquid latex. It's called milk or latex gold, it's referred to in different ways, but it's very liquidy and people dry it out in these pits in the ground with the help of a little bit of a chemical compound. But when you pile that much of this rubber into Mr. Com's son's truck, it leaves a very strong smelling drip along the road. And so the company guy, when I saw him, said, that guy says he's collecting from villages that have independent smallholders. But I know he's going to my areas because I can see the drips on the road and I can smell him coming. So there was a bit of a feud between the Chinese company and Mr. Com, clever Mr. Com. So that's what I encountered in about 2017, 2018 when I was going to these areas for dissertation work. So a lot of deforestation initiatives are things that I'm going to be talking about today. Deforestation is really important because crops like rubber have boomed across Southeast Asia. There are a couple of reasons I won't go into geographically, but Southeast Asia is a very dynamic place for crop booms. You can see rubber kind of moved from, rubber's traditionally grown in like Indonesia, Malaysia. It's a little bit warmer in those places, and it's kind of in the last 20 years, it's moved upwards, partly because China was up in the north really trying to produce rubber and building new cultivars that make it more tolerant. But basically, rubber has been moving north. And because it's shifted north so quickly, it's been very entangled in deforestation. Rubber, about 90% of rubber is produced in Southeast Asia. Only 4 countries in Southeast Asia produce 73% of it. So don't get entangled in this, but look if you want. But there's a big unevenness in terms of how much China consumes. China's doing a ton of tire production, a ton of producing belts and hoses and other things that go into industrial products beyond tires as well, that are all coming through or from China that use a lot of rubber. But you can see Indonesia and Thailand are really the main exporters. Vietnam is exporting a lot. Vietnam produces quite a bit of rubber, but it doesn't have the capacity right now to add much value to it, so it's exporting a lot. India is a big producer. rubber has ended up, I'm going to switch slides order. Rubber has ended up producing a lot of deforestation. So you can see big hots, but this is where rubber has been planted. And this is from a paper that I have not cited, which I should, from Yunxia Wang et al. 2023. They traced rubber here and they looked at how much of it drove deforestation. And places in, especially in mainland Southeast Asia, have been especially stark in terms of rubber-driven deforestation, partly because where it was planted in Indonesia and Malaysia, they were formerly colonial plantations of other types of tree crops. But when it moved into mainland Southeast Asia, it was being planted, just like in the Nambak case that I just told you guys about. It was planted a lot of times in upland areas where the ethnic minorities were seen as meeting some kind of market connection. And it was also just kind of places that were available. Shifting cultivation was a big target when it came to where rubber was planted, but just also any available land. Rubber has also been very associated with land conflicts, especially in those hotspots in Cambodia. There were really terrible cases of people getting completely kicked off their land. Across Laos, that we've seen this as well, Myanmar, other places. And rubber is not the only crop, but it was booming into the 2000s with really high prices. So rubber conflicts with people were a really big focus. And I'll kind of come back to how that sparked outcry in a bit. But yeah, to give you another sense, rubber has created an estimated, just in 10 years, from 2005 to 2015, an estimated 2 million hectares of rubber was planted during this boom era. And Warren Thomas, many years ago, they kind of estimated that by 2024, 4.3 to 8.5 million would be planted. It's been like on the lower end of that because for price reasons partly, but 70% of what was planted in the Mekong region specifically, Herney and Fox estimated to have replaced forest. And then these later estimates have kind of, yeah, those are already done too. So rubber is not the only crop that has been creating a huge amount of deforestation. There's been, in the certain ways that you might count it, about 90% of tropical deforestation is estimated to be coming from agriculture, actually replacing forest. And many organizations are devoted to tracking deforestation and attributing it to specific agricultural commodities. You can see this map is just one of the latest maps by the Global Forest Watch of agriculture-driven deforestation. Now, a lot of initiatives have sprung up in response. You can kind of think of initiatives, there's a million ways to categorize them. You can categorize them, yeah, I'll get to that in the next slide. But there's many supply side initiatives. I think of those as the old school ones, kind of land use planning, land use zoning, figure out zones where you don't want any agricultural to be expanding there, right? Having agricultural and forest policies. These are all focused on the places where the deforestation happens. A big innovation that has happened, I think, and coming kind of in the like neoliberal era of like, oh, the markets should solve this, has been a shift towards, on one hand, using market-based initiatives. A lot of these have targeted still the places where where deforestation happens. So it might be things like REDD+ or carbon carbon credit trading, things that are market driven and fancy. But you also have, I think, a positive shift towards also saying we should look at larger supply chains, connections across the world, to look at how actors beyond where the commodities are produced could and should be held responsible. So you have more demand side things emerging, tropical timber boycotts, commodity certification. Can anyone name a forest certification? That's the whole name. Okay. Anyways, there are a lot of certifications coming out, right? And in some products, you see a wave of certifications. So you have the forest stewardship certification, which certifies that a timber crop has come from somewhere that is sustainably managed. But a lot of other certifications have popped up. Sometimes the more, the worse. Sometimes more of them creates momentum. Lots of literature on that. Forest legality verification is a bit of a precursor to the EUDR. And due diligence, if you don't know what that means, it means the company who's buying, who's downstream, they are responsible for figuring out what their supply chain looks like, doing diligence on who their suppliers are and making sure that those suppliers are adhering to legal requirements or whatever the due diligence is targeted at. There's also a lot of things that would also fit into these things. There's a whole ocean of kind of voluntary things that companies on the demand side or the supply side might do, like responsible agricultural practices, good agricultural practices, responsible investment things, standards across sectors, codes of conduct by companies, et cetera. And there are a million ways of kind of measuring and comparing these. So you can look at what scale they're supposed to operate. Is it the whole sector? Is it all sectors ever? Is it, you know, with the Forest Stewardship Council, all types of timber products, and it has moved into even rubber latex. You can measure stringency in a million ways. You can measure kind of this policy versus market driven kind of spectrum. A lot of them have either carrots or sticks. You know, certifications are much more carrot. You get a higher, ideally a higher price premium if you have organic certification. Some are more stick side, so sanctions and bans. Sometimes many good programs actually integrate both. And then the creation of norms, standards, and the way, you know, forests are defined has created like a nauseating amount of literature just debating the definition of forests and then forest loss. So a whole world of things, fun things to study forever. The angle that I find really helpful, because I think it helps us position the actors in terms of their market power with relationship to each other, is taking a bit of I would call it a commodity chain approach if you want to get into politics, but we can think of it as, we'll call it a supply chain approach. So in the case of rubber, you can think of the rubber supply chain kind of structured this way, where you have the majority of rubber in the world is actually produced by smallholders across Africa, Latin America, across the world. It's a tropical crop that spans everywhere. So you also have a lot of companies at the same time, like the Chinese and Vietnamese companies I study, who have planted plantations, but you've got industrial plantations, smallholder plantations. These all kind of go into, get picked up by traders like Mr. Kam, brought to a factory. The factory essentially like chops up, cleans, and dries the latex and gets sent off into many other directions. Singapore is basically where a lot of Southeast Asian rubber gets piled and then sold elsewhere. But it ends up in our tires, our shoes, a lot of other things. The nice thing about a commodity chain approach is that it looks at the division of labor and the relationships with different actors that are in producing commodities. And it kind of, you can think of supply chains as having different types of power dynamics. Some of them are very much driven by the buyer. So for example, you could think of t-shirts. Anyone can create, almost anyone can make a t-shirt, right? The value added is something between creativity and the process of manufacturing it. But the dollar value jumps basically by who's buying it, where it's sold to them. But basically you have a market where you can have a huge number of manufacturers and the buyer is dictating where the value and price kind of is contributed. Whereas if you think about the automobile industry, that's a very producer driven supply chain, in the sense that not a lot, more and more across the world, but it is astonishing how difficult it is to make an automobile. The buyer only has usually a few options of brands. We would have more options if Chinese EVs were on our markets. That's a whole other presentation. But you can think of agricultural chains really as ones where it is very much downstream, if you think of the supply chain as a stream, but very much buyer driven. But also it's weird. It's not like other food crops, like organic apples, where the actual end consumer is making individual choice even within a bin of which apple they're going to choose. It's more like the big tire companies plus the automobile companies who buy them, et cetera, are interested, but they have the power in this because it's agricultural chains are like that. So the EUDR kind of emerges in this broader ecosystem of interesting demand side driven initiatives. And there's been a big debate as to whether, I do think it's very good that the EU is taking responsibility as a major consumer, but there's debate as to whether it's also a source of green imperialism. And I'll talk about that at the very end lightly. But the EUDR is aiming to reduce deforestation that's caused by European consumption. It was already agreed upon by the European Union member states in 2023. It was supposed to enter into force in 2023, but it was delayed until December 30th, 2024, and has been redelayed few weeks ago, I just rewrote a grant in the last week because of the stupid delay. But it's not going to go into effect. Well, I rewrite it. It's not going to go into effect this December. It's been postponed. People don't know how long, but it's been controversial, I think, needless to say. And the postponements are basically voiced in terms of how much effort it is to establish mechanisms to monitor all of the EU's imported goods. They focus on a few specific commodities. So they focus on oil palm, soy, wood, cocoa, coffee, cattle, and rubber was added at the last minute. And that's also a whole other conversation. But the EU is aiming to focus on these forest risk commodities and try to shift its responsibility, reduce deforestation by using its market power as a consuming market. It has a couple components that are really key, that these are components that are in a lot of other initiatives like this. So, so this is Constance McDermott. She's published a lot on really related stuff, but she kind of summarizes that the EUDR aims to harness the EU's global market power to catalyze a reduction in commodity-driven deforestation. It has these components of due diligence. So companies have to make sure when they're in the EU and importing these commodities from outside, they have to make sure that the people that they buy them from are adhering to certain requirements. And basically this requires a lot of people in the middle of these supply chains to have in terms of where they get their stuff from. So benchmarking is this funny thing where they've said, they've rated all the countries in the world and said how much paperwork has to be done based on whether that country has a ton of deforestation or very little overall. So it's kind of like, we don't want everyone to run around doing the same amount of a lot of paperwork. We're going to kind of temper it, but based on your record of deforestation at a country level. And then legality is just kind of, when you look into the documentation, they're trying to make sure that there's a lot of specifics in that as well. But has it been a commodity that produced deforestation, with other questions within legality? So that's basically how the EUDR works. Around the EUDR have sprung up a bunch of technical tools, people trying to figure out how to help companies and all the people in between the producers and all the companies in between figure out how to prove to the EU that they are not driving deforestation. These are really the Accountability Framework, Trace Initiative, and the Watch Pro, but they basically got people watching the forests, people connecting those forests through kind of trade and commodity flow data. And the Accountability Framework, they have like very interesting ways that to hold the companies accountable and to do accountability tracking. So I haven't started personally studying the EUDR in much depth, but it's come to drive my research in ways that I'll say in the next piece of the talk. And what I'm trying to link is the way that past initiatives in the rubber sector actually could help us think through the strengths and weaknesses of the EUDR and how it could be designed in better ways. So I'm going to just talk about the bulk of our research. So this research I've started kind of years ago when I was a PhD student. There were people basically across Laos saying, we need to trace the rubber sector. We need to know what the rubber supply chain looks like from Laos onward, because basically a bunch of countries, Norway was one of the ones that I ended up doing a consultancy for indirectly. But a bunch of NGOs around the region were saying all these countries are worried about deforestation and want to know the rubber supply chain within this area so that they can start thinking about how to initiate these demand side initiatives. So I'm doing this work with Tao. I'm going to read through this in a second so you don't have to, but Tao Wen is a master's student in the Faculty of Forestry at UBC. He's my first master's student. And he was born and raised in Hanoi, but he did his high school onwards here in Canada. He went to McGill. If anyone works on Southeast Asia, he worked with Sarah Turner, who's wonderful, for his undergrad project, but he did a degree in environment and development at McGill, and he has been here since I started my second year in 2023, and he is in the field right now. He just finished up his second field season in Laos. His first was in Vietnam, interviewing a lot of companies, and he says in his free time he loves playing and watching sports and cooking. So that's Tao. We are basically doing two cases that we're trying to compare together. So what we're doing is taking three cases, one Chinese, one Vietnamese, and one multi-level. And looking at why the private sector actors in those cases have decided to initiate sustainable rubber activities, how those activities are designed and carried out. And we kind of are trying to compare them along these kind of vectors of comparison. We're looking at like, where are those actors within the supply chain and what's their relationship to others? What are their motivations for establishment? We've kind of teased this out based on the timing, things that have happened to those actors in that rubber sector in the past few years. We've gone to a lot of sustainability workshops and events and things like that, interviewed people in those initiatives and then others along with. And we're trying to look at the design and implementation and impacts. But I have to say, all three of these, they always say that they're going to be started very quickly. But the reason this has dragged on since my postdoc is that COVID hit and et cetera. And so the implementation is still ongoing, but they're ongoing many more years more than the EUDR. We were in, but the basic trajectory, prices were starting to rise. And there was a lot of talk about like transnational investment being a boon to rural development. So a lot of places like Laos, Cambodia, Myanmar were welcoming foreign investors at the encouragement of the World Bank, right? The World Bank was going around titling land and saying, this will make it much more inviting for investors who will kickstart your rural economies. So huge amounts of rubber expansion. Very early on, you have like just some tire companies getting together, putting together some kind of cross-sector initiatives to look at environmental sustainability. But what really hit was this Rubber Barons report in 2013, which exposed corruption, land conflicts, and a bunch of issues in Laos and Cambodia's rubber sectors, linked specifically to Vietnamese companies. As a result, through a really impressive amount of advocacy by multiple levels of NGOs, the Forest Stewardship Council disassociated from the Vietnam Rubber Group. The ICC, which is a financial institution, went through a huge process of kind of conflict resolution with the Vietnam Rubber Group and with, with a private Vietnamese company. And this kickstarted a lot of panic, I would say, among Chinese companies, among rubber companies across the region. But on the other hand, you had places like Michelin, which is a big company, Ford, vehicle companies, kind of putting out there a bunch of their own sustainability initiatives in the rubber sector. So the three that we study are the Chinese guidelines, which was established in 2017, 2018, this multilateral one, and 2019, the Vietnamese guidelines. And you have the EUDR in 2023. This is the report that I won't go into, but it was very sexy in terms of its marketing and it had a huge impact. But this came out in 2013 by Global Witness. And as a result, this Vietnamese company ended up having to go through this IFC process of grievance adjudication. And this indirectly kickstarted the Vietnam Rubber Group, which is a state-owned company. So these are the three that we've compared. GPSNR stands for Global Platform for Sustainable Natural Rubber, and it was established kind of as an outgrowth of the tire industry project. So it initially was really tire companies, downstream organizations, but they've integrated through a membership system a bunch of other people along the supply chain. You have the Guidance for Sustainable Natural Rubber. It's Chinese in a sense, but it was essentially funded by UK money. So the equivalent of, UK aid initiated it, and it was, but it's been rolled out and implemented by the Chinese Chamber of Commerce for Metals, Minerals, and Chemicals, which is a sectoral kind of representative of people who buy rubber. So you can still think of this as downstream. And then you kind of have what I think of as the midstream / upstream. The Vietnamese voluntary guidelines for investors in agriculture, this was specific to the Mekong subregion. It was done with Oxfam and the Vietnam Chamber of Commerce and Industry, as well as some Vietnamese local NGOs. So a very interesting mix of people, but essentially representing a lot of Vietnamese companies. Okay, so GPSNR you can think of as motivating broader shifting norms, even going back to 2005 of like companies picking up sustainability at sectoral levels. It's all the tire companies kind of getting together. But there were really serious put together by international NGOs. Mighty Earth was probably the most active. And there was pressure even after the people who tire companies sell to, the automobile companies, to act. And the incentive that it would be a first mover advantage. If you do this first, you have the advantage of doing it before others and setting the norms. They have put into a place, I'm not going to, but we can kind of come back to this slide if you're interested, but they've basically put into place a system where companies monitor themselves, show that monitoring process to the GPSNR, and they go through like a long process of kind of setting a lot of things up and verifying with GPSNR. So it's semi-voluntary, but it's very structured. It has very specific mechanisms built in. The Vietnam case, quickly. The Vietnam case was very much, the Vietnamese companies were very much motivated specifically by the fact that what was happening in Cambodia and Laos and exposed in that global witness report had made it very difficult for them to operate. They were literally losing land in the case of the Hagel one that I showed. But they were also very worried because they wanted to shift away from selling all of their rubber to China. Most of their rubber still goes to China. They wanted to sell more and more to the EU, to North America. There's higher price premiums in those places, but they also have higher requirements and are very scared of reputational issues. And they also ended up having state pressure. What was the final thing that broke the camel's back was that the Vietnam Chamber of Commerce and Industry went to Oxfam and said, we need to pull you into a room together with Vietnamese rubber companies to figure out how to fix their image problem and fix their business issues in Cambodia and Laos. And really a big part of this again was like the Forest Stewardship Council dropping them. So that's another market access issue that the Vietnamese were facing. So Tao has been doing this side of the research, and he has uncovered really, really interesting outcomes. He's basically found that the Vietnamese companies are now at the point, this is coming from research that he did last summer, where, I have 2 more minutes. Okay, thank you. The Vietnamese companies have said to Tao the following, that this is the direction the world is heading into, and we find if we want to stay in business. They're also saying sustainability is an inevitable requirement of the market. If we do this, we'll be able to diversify further with our clients and penetrate more stringent markets. So the Vietnamese have really been motivated to shift. They've been doing gender-based stuff. They've been doing community engagement things. I don't want to paint them as perfect. A lot of it, I could get into how stringent it is, but ultimately in the cases, they are a side of the case that's very, very active. And they're seeing this as a new norm. The China rubber sector case is an interesting kind of contrast. So they were very motivated also by reputational concerns. They were seeing issues of land conflicts, holding back their ability to get land in Laos is something I've documented. But they're also getting general state pressure from China to green. It's hard to measure how much that affected it. But ultimately, it wasn't a lot of pressure that they were under, right? They sell mostly to their own Chinese market, whereas the Vietnamese are trying to sell to other more competitive markets. So a former staff of CCCMC, which is the implementing organization of the guidelines, said CCCMC just doesn't have enough leverage over these companies. A lot of times when I was interviewing them, they would ask if I could introduce them to Lao-based Chinese rubber companies. They're in Beijing, they don't really have a lot of connections to producers. They've just put these guidelines forth, funded by the UK, aid money and others, and at the encouragement but they didn't have a lot of leverage. But what's really interesting is a lot of Chinese companies, especially tire companies who are selling on international markets, not only to China, so pretty high-end tire companies, they have actually started joining GPSNR, hoping that they would find out how to deal with EUDR, how to deal with FSC, how to deal with a bunch of other certifications that they're trying to deal with. So she said that this other interviewee said that joining the GPSNR has actually become a way that Chinese actors are finding to figure out norms in the industry around sustainability, but they also are using it to try to figure out what their competitors are doing. So in this sense, I think if we think of the Chinese and Vietnamese cases together, you have a sense that sustainability is becoming the norm, and it's becoming a new aspect of business competitiveness. So taken together, I mean, we have differences across these, but very much the Chinese sector is the case where there's the weakest amount of leverage over these companies. They sell mostly to their own country. They're not subject to these other requirements and market pressures the way that Vietnamese are. The initiative targeted rubber producing companies, and specifically they started talking about a smallholder specific one, but it's by an actor that's very far downstream, doesn't have much leverage and doesn't have much to offer in terms of carrots. but they have seen them instead jumping over to the GPSNR. The Vietnamese have been this middle case where kind of all of the Vietnamese sector is moving together. And I think this is a bit of a dynamic because one of the main targeted companies of pressure was the main state-owned company of the Vietnam Rubber Group. They work closely with the government office that was pressuring them to start engaging and shifting their behavior. And they also try very hard to sell to higher end markets. So you've seen a lot of change in behavior there. And the GPSNR is kind of this other piece of the equation, but they're all, I think, interacting. So what does this lead me to kind of conclude? I'm calling these concluding reflections because work is still in process. A lot of these trade-based, a lot of the EUDR can be seen kind of as a trade-based policy, right? It's demand side, but it's in a good way trying to promote consumer responsibility. But if you think about broader things that are happening right now and why has there been a setback in terms of the second postponement, I mean, it's just, I don't really know, I'm not inside of those rooms, but it is not a great moment right now for trade-based policies initiated by one powerful market actor, right? It's not the right moment for that in some senses. So I think that's the backdrop. And there have been a lot of critiques of the fact that, you know, that a lot of countries that are producing these commodities are formerly colonized countries. They struggle with unequal trade relations with the EU already. They struggle with sovereign debt that drains resources. And there's been great research on this campus by Jessica Dempsey and others in terms of how countries that are formerly colonized and or have a lot of debt, that feeds into their need to exploit resources, right? So a consideration when it comes to these policies. And then it's also inequality between consumers and producers is not necessarily solved by this approach. I have to have a Spider-Man quote because I have two small boys. They don't watch the movies or anything, but they just somehow, he's only 4, but it somehow is like part of our lives anyways. When we think of, from a supply chain approach, how much power does the EU actually have? In some sense, I would say that they have not a lot of power. They in a lot of these commodities, for example, rubber, they maybe are 18% of the market. So that's a lot. It's not a huge draw globally necessarily, but individual Chinese companies that I gave the example of joining the GPSNR. So individual companies in a lot of these supply chains in a lot of different producing countries might have a disproportionate amount they sell to the EU. But I think it's working more as an example, as something it's a big enough piece of the pie that it's getting a lot of attention. And even if it's not creating pressure on countries that are producing these products in a real monetary way, it's reshaping environmental norms in these sectors because it's the main, it's the biggest kind of market that is making these norms established and actionable. So you can think of it in different ways, just the piece of the pie that they have for market power versus kind of the symbolic influence it has. And I think that's a little bit bigger. But if we come back to Mr. Kum and the example in Laos, I think there's implementation challenges that haven't been resolved. In the Nambac case, smallholders are very hard to trace. So one of the things that Tao has been finding now that he's been in Laos to follow up on the Vietnamese companies in Laos, one thing those companies are doing is dropping smallholders from their chain. They have their established factories already. They have their own plantations. And even though they can't fill their factories every day of the year with their own plantations product, they're just going and finding other Vietnamese companies, sometimes 2 provinces over, which if you've ever driven a truck with dripping liquid latex, you would know that's not efficient. But they're going that far in hopes of making their whole supply chain clean of basically undocumented smallholders. And in Mr. Kum's case, like surveillance, monitoring means surveillance, documentation means surveillance. He operates in some ways by resisting surveillance. So there's a bunch of ways in which getting smallholders as part of this is a problem. And there's been initiatives to include smallholders in the GPSNR and others. But right now, I think they're mostly decorative. I'm not going to go into that because it's a whole other can of worms, but I'm going to leave it at that. So thank you all very, very much for your attention. 10 minutes? Okay, we have a few minutes for questions if anyone has them.